Hi everyone, we are going to do a short video today about the impact of war. We're really going to focus about the impact that it had on African Americans, on women, and on soldiers. So we're going to start off with the impact the Civil War had on African Americans. And African Americans served in the Union Army and Navy after the Emancipation Proclamation. And just as a reminder, the Emancipation Proclamation freed all the slaves in the rebelling states. So after Lincoln gave the Emancipation Proclamation, which he gave a few days after the Battle of Antietam, African Americans were able to serve in the Army and the Navy. Now, when African Americans served in the military, they were known as the contraband armies. So if you hear contraband armies, that's referring to the African American armies. And enslaved African Americans seized the opportunity presented by the approach of Union troops to achieve freedom. And all this really means is they ran to Union troops when they saw they could fight and be free. So if you're a slave and you're an enslaved African American and you're working on a field in the South, and all of a sudden you see the Union Army coming, more often than not, they ran to the Union Army because the Union Army was fighting to free them. So they wanted to leave and be free. And many fought with distinction, and they were eventually paid salaries that were equal to those of white soldiers. So at the beginning of the war, they got paid much less. But by the end of the war, they were paid equal, the same as white soldiers. It's just a brief photo of some African Americans fighting in the Army. Now we're going to talk about the impact on common soldiers. And this war was very, very, very brutal. There was a lot of guns, but a lot of people did not have guns. So lots of times when there was no guns, soldiers often had to use their hands and swords or knives. This is known as hand-to-hand combat. They weren't shooting people. They had knives, they had swords, or they were literally just using their hands trying to punch people, strangle them, whatever they can do. And after the war, and especially in the South, soldiers return home to find destroyed homes, farms, and poverty. So that just means they were poor. Now, they had no money when they returned to their house. If you remember Sherman, he was the Union general, and he went through the South, he burned everything. So a lot of the soldiers from the South, when they came home, they had nothing. And soldiers on both sides lived with permanent disabilities. And disability can be something like how lots of soldiers lost their arms, they lost their legs, some became blind, some were deaf, they couldn't hear, lots of injuries. This photo is a good example. This man lost both of his arms, so he no longer has arms, and that happened to a lot of soldiers during this time. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about is the impact the war had on women. And men fought in the war, women did not. So while men are away, women managed homes and families with scarce, that means few resources. They didn't have much money, they didn't have much food, and a lot of them had to work twice as hard. If they took care of the family and the man worked on the farm, they had to do both. They had to work on the farm and they had to take care of their families. They also faced poverty and hunger. This led to something called the Bread Riots in Richmond, Virginia, which we're going to learn about. But they didn't have much. It was hard to get food during this time in the South. And they also weren't making as much money because the husband was away. So the North and South faced poverty. And women assumed new roles in agriculture, nursing, and war industries. War industry is something like building guns and weapons. And this impacted their employment because a lot of women never did agriculture before. They never farmed. They never were in nursing, really. They never worked in factories building things. So after the war, a lot of women enjoyed these jobs, and they didn't want to go back to being a stay-at-home mom. So many women had trouble adjusting to life after the war, which is the back to the house while the husband worked. A lot of them were working and they enjoyed working and they did just as good a job as men. So it was hard for some women to be working and then go back to not working. And Richmond, Virginia had something called the Bread Riots in 1863. And with the war waging in the South, food was becoming scarce, which means it was hard to find. And in the South, railroads were destroyed. So when railroads are destroyed, how are they going to get food to your city? There's no trains, there's no cars. It takes a long time for food to get there. Ships were blocked by Union forces. So remember the North, the Union, they blocked all the ocean so no boats can go in. And crops were destroyed and burned. And because there was no food, women in Richmond, Virginia became angry at the lack of food and started breaking into bakeries and stealing food. So this is a photo. They couldn't feed their family. See, there's a little boy over here who needs food. They started breaking into stores, into restaurants, just stealing as much food as they can. And it was a big event because the military had to come in and actually stop these women from stealing all the stuff. But they didn't have food and they had to feed their families. All right, like I said, it was a pretty short video. That's it for today. If you have any questions, let me know.